CEOs and companies are dealing with increasingly sophisticated audiences, where skepticism is the default. You're listening to the Business Extra podcast coming from The National in Abu Dhabi. I'm Mustafa Al-Rawi, Assistant Editor-in-Chief. With me is co-host and The National's feature editor, Kelsey Warner. Hi, Kelsey.
Hey, Mustafa.
So, two major events before we get into the show. One is we're in the studio together.
Yes. A whole new world. 2 years later, we're here. It's good to be back.
With a guest.
Yes.
But also, people can see us. We're on camera.
Terrifying.
Exciting, I would say. But so if you want to watch us, watch the Business Extra podcast, you can now do so on YouTube.
Right. Lights, camera, action.
As well as the National's website, of course. So this is where we're going now. People have demanded this for years. We want to see the people who are speaking.
A true omni-channel experience with Business Extra these days. Yeah, we're on, across all platforms.
Exactly. So it makes it for a richer experience for the viewer and the listener, I hope.
Exactly.
So today's topic is essentially about trust. It's been more than ever on the agenda these past few years because we realized at some point, given the effects of social media and technology and economic crises and political crises, that perhaps we didn't have a handle on trust as much as we thought we did.
The information that we're consuming. Lex Friedman, who's an AI researcher at MIT and a voice that I like to look to sometimes, said recently that it is getting harder and harder to know what is true. And it's a trite thought, but coming from him, who is a technology expert at the forefront looking ahead, this deluge of information, this audience skepticism, what we're seeing just within society, trust is becoming a competitive advantage. And if you have trust, you are better off, and societies potentially are better off if you know the information you're looking at is true.
With us today in our studio in Abu Dhabi, we're very happy to have a guest, given the last couple of years. Omar, it's lovely to have you here to talk about the Trust Barometer, once again. I know Edelman's been doing this for more than 2 decades, but it feels as if in the last few years in particular, the conversations around trust have become really, really pertinent. Obviously, trust has always been important, but now everyone's asking, do we have it? Can we get it back? Where is it? Where do we not have? These things are happening. And so I guess last year we talked a lot about how the pandemic influenced trust levels, and some of those trends are continuing to play out. But do you find that the kind of discussions around trust are becoming more pointed in the business community that you're moving around in?
100%. So we've been measuring trust for 22 years now, and there are certain global themes which play out. And the current one is we're in a cycle of distrust. And what we're seeing globally is that trust in mainly all institutions apart from business has collapsed. And we started to see that with the proliferation of fake news back in 2018. However, the UAE bucks that trend. So all 4 institutions, government, business, NGOs, and media are trusted in the UAE. And then the UAE as a country overall is the second most trusted country globally. And we survey 36,000 people in 28 countries. So I'm just setting the scene of that the UAE is always one of the most trusted governments and countries. But one of the key pillars from this year's report is that business has surged in terms of trust. So there's been an 11-point increase in trust in business. And from there's more expectations that CEOs become more vocal and talk about more difficult social issues, sustainability, etc. Because ultimately people are worried about their jobs. They're worried about automation. They're worried about things like efficiency savings and more competition for roles. So short answer, the UAE bucks the trend, but business is becoming more and more important, and trust is crucial to that.
There was a lot to unpack there, but I
Yes.
want us to take a step back. And you're in the communications business. Why is trust important to Edelman? Why is it important to society?
Yeah. So top line is that trust helps organizations build and protect their reputations. If you scratch beneath the surface of that, it means that you are able to track institutional investment, partners, for example, or attract the best talent. It also means that you're going to have more advocates in the market. And it also means that you are more resilient in times of crisis. People would see and believe what you're saying and actually buy your products and align with your organization or your company if it's something that actually aligns with their personal values.
Okay, so thinking about that as we're in a collapse of trust moment, yet the UAE is an outlier.
Mhm.
So what is lost by those who are experiencing the collapse, and what is gained by those who are bucking this trend?
That's an excellent question, and you can see that in the most definitive way on the economic optimism of the report slide. So globally, economic optimism, i.e., people in 5 years' time thinking they'll be better or worse off, has collapsed in the Western world. So you're actually seeing a decline in sort of people thinking that they're going to be better off. In the UAE, again, it's bucked the trend, and actually people will think they're actually going to be better off in 5 years' time. And that's because those institutions are leading by example. So I'll use the example I used this morning on the panel with you, in the sense of Mohammed bin Zayed was living and breathing sort of the values of trying to get through the pandemic together, because we were all in the same boat. Trust in that is actually built, so people will then become more optimistic that their futures are brighter.
I like this angle about the economic optimism, because if you look at your survey going back, there was a bit of a low point in 2016. And of course, we know what happened in the US in 2016. We had a surprise election result that brought in a president that people were, shocked to find there was a lot of support for.
Mhm.
But that could be because there was a lot of mistrust at the time, generally in institutions, but also because we'd been sort of 6 years into an economic downturn that seemed like it wasn't really improving. And with the UAE, the economic opportunities continue to be there. And because that's a focus, then you see that trust levels are perhaps higher than they might be elsewhere.
Mhm.
I just want to thread a quick needle here from 2016. I mean, the other thing, to the shock of the possibility that a wide voting bloc had fallen prey to potential misinformation, and that had resulted in a new election outcome that we hadn't expected. We had that whole Cambridge Analytica Facebook fiasco at the time. So I just want to add that kind
Mhm.
of thread there of, it wasn't just there was broad support, there was also the revelation of a misinformation, information warfare.
Yeah.
People were ready to believe the things that weren't true because there was a lack in trust in traditional sources of information, and
Mhm.
we lost that. So now the trend now looks like the last 5 years, judging by the survey, that it's coming back.
Mhm.
And is that because we're talking so much about it? I wonder.
So I think there are 2 points here. The first is that there's been a long-term move from a top-down approach in terms of people just believing governments globally or media globally, and you're more peer-to-peer. So people in your circles will reverberate sort of comments that you are more likely to believe. So people are more listening to people like me. The second thing is that it has been, as you rightly said, that fake news is an issue, and that issue hasn't gone away. And people are still concerned about fake news in the latest report for us, not just in terms of actually, okay, how do I tell what's accurate and not accurate, but fake news intentionally being used as a weapon for misinformation. It's the latest version of World War II propaganda being dropped from planes. It's the leaflets.
I mean, the least trusted source of information, according to the survey, is social media. So people understand now that if something is on social media, you might have to see it more than once,
Yeah.
several times, right, to actually believe it. So it tells me two things. One is good for people to understand that when you see something on social media, it isn't true. I'm happy to see that we get it, and maybe I'm underestimating people to think that it's a good thing. They should have known this anyway. But then the second thing is, do we just have to live with this now? Is this telling me that this has become a cost of business almost? You're going to have to deal with fake news, whether it's as a business countering rumors in the market, or disgruntled people saying stuff about your services on social media, or as a government, or as an individual. Do we now just have to accept this is it, because people are beginning to distinguish between good sources of information and bad, rather than let's stamp out fake news?
Mhm. So actually, as a communicator in 20 years, it's actually best practice to gather your information from different sources so you can actually get different perspectives on things. If we bring it down to the actual latest report, again, the UAE bucks the trend. So globally, media isn't trusted and it's actually in the red zone. But in the UAE, actually media, the four sources, search engines, traditional media, owned media, and social media, they're not distrusted, right? So actually search engines and traditional media are still trusted sources of information, while owned media, so your own websites, et cetera, and social media are neutral. So there's still a job to do, Sorry.
No, it's interesting that you say that and that the survey finds that because the UAE is one of the few countries in the world that actually regulates social media use.
Mhm.
So I do think that there's probably a level of trust in the social media that we're consuming here
Mhm.
because, Facebook and the like have hid behind First Amendment rights in the US to basically abdicate responsibility for the information that gets spread on their platforms. But here there is a level of
I think the government takes responsibility for the potential harm that could
regulation.
be caused
One
by,
word,
by,
regulation.
by anything. I think that's their first consideration is, does this cause harm? And often that can frustrate people that live in this region. It's not just the UAE, but maybe it's culturally. People get frustrated. The government immediately is like, wait, slow down,
Sure.
Mm.
But it is interesting and surprising to me, and maybe a lesson to be learned from other countries struggling to regulate social media, that it does in fact promote trust in marketplaces
Mhm.
where there is regulation for the information spread online via social media.
100%. And I think, and I mentioned this, that actually fake news being used as a weapon, so intentionally malicious. And because it's regulated here and people actually trust it more, that there's more faith in the system, that the information they're actually consuming has been one aligned with local laws and regulations and actually comes from reliable sources. If you compare the actual results, social media in France is on 19%. In the UAE, it's on 57%. Even on search engines, there's a massive 30-point gap in terms of people actually trusting the information that they consume from search engines in the UAE compared to other markets such as US, Australia, and Japan.
If we look back sort of 10 years ago, there was this sort of disintegration of the idea that my employer looks after me, that my job is somewhere that I can feel I can grow with and stay with. And, we had the explosion of the gig economy that kind of made it even less sort of permanent, this idea of employment. But what we've seen now, and particularly here, is a flip of this, a 180. The pandemic taught a lot of people, lucky people, obviously there were people that experienced bad times, but for lucky people that got through it, they realized their employer was looking out for them. They realized that, my employer, my boss, people were taking ownership of that again, which was really nice. And we talked about it last year that, internal communications in a company were highly trusted, and that trend's continued now. So employers have this really, really good opportunity to kind of continue that platform.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think what the pandemic taught us was that actually there needs to be consistency. So if it's HR putting out internal messages, if it's content on your website, if it's the CEO speaking, that there has to be a consistent position, and companies do need to take a position on issues. So more and more stakeholders are actually holding businesses to account. They will vote with their dirhams. They will vote in terms of, well, actually, I don't want to work for this company because it doesn't align with my own values and beliefs. And then globally, we're seeing ESG becoming more and more a reporting mechanism for investors in terms of, are we actually going to partner with this company if it doesn't fit in with addressing social issues? So absolutely, my employer has become a trusted source of information. And I've been advising clients in Abu Dhabi and in the region. And I haven't just been speaking to my client, the chief communications officer, but I've been advising the business continuity team, the HR director, about what they should be doing from a policy perspective to retain the trust of internal stakeholders and make sure that employees feel safe during the pandemic, that they're going over and above.
So thinking about this in this environment where, okay, trust is down for media, governments, seemingly every entity other than business.
Globally. But in the UAE, it's all up.
Okay. Except for our outlier, the UAE. But okay, so businesses and CEOs are some of the most trusted organizations and humans on the planet right now during a time when the world is on fire. We have existential threats facing us. Are they up to the challenge? They better be. This is like a huge opportunity for them to honestly fail.
Mm-hmm. So I think over the past 24 months, we've actually seen them step up. I didn't know I was on so many distribution lists for companies, and I didn't hear as much from CEOs as I have done over the past 24 months. The other piece is that companies are going over and above. There's an expectation that CEOs do talk about more difficult societal issues. And I mentioned this on our panel this morning. The pandemic has made us realize that we should be doing these things anyway, right? CEOs should be talking about these topics. They shouldn't just be in an office coming out for the annual general meeting or actually in the annual report, but people want to hear from the business leaders about what their organizations are actually doing. Even from a cultural perspective, You build culture from the top. You lead by example. And me as a CEO running Edelman in the region, I lead by example. Like, I was an intern 20 years ago, right? I started off like cutting out newspaper articles, faxing it to ministers with a Pritt stick and stuff. So I make sure that everyone from the bottom of the business to the top of the business has the same values. And that is by being proactive, by being visible, and being honest and empathetic with them. I randomly call my staff just to check they're okay. That's the gone are the days where it's all top down now.
I mean, 20 years ago,
It was a long time ago.
wasn't implying that, but rather that the theory, the economic theory, the prevailing belief of the day was if you pursue profit, everything else falls into line. That if you're profitable, it means you're efficient. It means you have good impact. It means you don't do bad things, and it means that we don't have any problems in society. Now, obviously, 20 years on, we all know that this was, theory, good theory. In practice, we're looking at it now and realizing you have to do more. So for whether it's CEOs or businesses, have to think about their impact. So in your survey, you highlighted issues that audiences want their CEOs to be involved in. So this is different from politics. This isn't sort of like lobbying or funding a party to be in power to suit your agenda. This is actually a CEO saying, I care about climate change. I care about job security. I care about technology. I care about immigration, inequality, discrimination, COVID vaccination policies. And I will work to influence these policies to the best of my ability. And that's what is expected. Now, to be blunt, that could get in the way of profit making if a CEO is doing that. But then again, the theory is that if you're touching all these different topics that have impact, then the business should take care of itself. Do you agree with that?
So my perspective is that organizations are expected to take a stand on certain issues. So at Edelman, globally, we want 50% of our leadership to be females. In the Middle East, I am part of the Dubai Business Women's Council, where I mentor women starting up their own businesses. We have a mentorship stream in the Middle East called GWEN, Global Women Edelman's Network. I have taken a stand on gender parity in the business in the Middle East. What I'm not doing is commenting on every single issue that actually is a social issue. But where I'm asked about it, then I am expected to have a position on that. So it's not rent a quote, but if your employees, partners, and the market that you're operating in the industry see that you believe in something and you're following through on it, that's where you're going to build trust.
I mean, the other thing too, if CEOs are the face of change, then they actually do need to be representative of the population that they represent. And so if they are the face of change, that would currently be fairly old and male, to be blunt. So it is part of a risk mitigation strategy, honestly, to have diversity, because we need to participate in this world. And if we're commanding change from CEOs, then the only ones who are going to be able to marshal it are not just the old men.
Well, it comes back to resilience. So if you have a diverse executive team, you're likely to have different ideas, different experiences to draw on when you get into a crisis. If everyone is, as you put it, old and white, then
statistically they
are. The chances are when we run into trouble, everyone's going to have the same idea. And if it's a bad idea, we're in trouble. Think about the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. That was the same people coming up with the same idea that just really didn't work.
And so, I mean, I see in terms of this current trend looking ahead, if CEOs are the face of change, then CEOs, the face of that change, needs to rapidly change. Otherwise, they're going to suffer the same trust erosion that governments, media, and the rest have had over the last few years.
And honestly, I think there are 2 points here. That's why I love living in the UAE, because it's such a diverse society. And the second point is that, like as Mustafa rightly said, that you have to take a diverse viewpoint. You can't just be like, well, this is what I believe in. You actually have to have a team around you that is diverse and can give you different perspectives to help inform business decisions.
We talked a lot about the UAE, but you've also put out a report about Saudi Arabia as well. And there's a lot of similarities. Very high trust in government, very high trust in business. The economic optimism is high, not quite as high as the UAE, but it's been high in Saudi for a while because there's been a lot of changes. Young people have been brought in. There's been more access to employment for women. So there's a lot of change over there. But I think the difference is that what I saw in the report was really interesting. It was trust in outsiders has been rising in Saudi Arabia, which is really interesting for the future because it would have been not a closed country, but one that perhaps was more focused domestically inward than outward. And so now we're seeing as it changes that trust in sort of other ideas, other people coming in, that can only be good for, again, diversity and resilience.
Yeah. So I think the interesting point here is that Saudi Arabia is also one of the most trusted countries in the world. And they've been on this journey for the past, since 2016 under Saudi Vision 2030, where the social and economic reforms are massively benefiting the younger population there in terms of employment opportunities, entertainment. They're bringing in global brands into the country, which I grew up in Saudi in the 80s until I was 12, 13. It's a completely different country what it was to then. So there's that point. The other one is that as the country modernizes and opens up, then you do become more trusting of the people you're actually engaging with, right? If you have more of a conversation with someone, or if you're talking to someone day to day, you're more likely to trust them rather than what unfortunately was happening in the 70s and 80s in Saudi, where consultants were coming in trying to sell something and then just leaving and basically half baking something. Now there's actually delivery and transparency and accountability and partnerships that are actually being built. And that's where trust comes into it.
Do you think that you talk about transparency, do you think that the trend through COVID where, you talked about Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, on camera, talking about his experience. I mean, that's a high level of transparency from a ruler. And do you think this trend will continue? Do you think once people have expected a certain level of transparency that it can't be rolled back?
100%. I think transparency goes in hand with accountability at the same time. I think there are an increasing number of communications channels where people are actually seeing what's actually going on. So it's no longer just a daily newspaper, but people can go on to, like, take The National, for example, a podcast, the YouTube channel, your social media channels. As journalists, you're encouraged to actually tweet content. So I think the transparency comes with also the accountability piece, and people consume that information across multiple channels. My one is, one of my places I go to is LinkedIn in terms of gathering my information. I know that you guys are very active on that as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a super fan of LinkedIn.
Yeah, 100%.
It's positively embarrassing. I'm curious. Okay, so you've gathered the insights. What happens now? What do you do with them? What are your takeaways from 2022?
In terms of actually, I've taken up some information. I hope that it kind of makes the world a better place on the most basic forms, in terms of it helps educate me, helps open my eyes in terms of actually having different perspectives and actually being more open to differing views to what I would normally have. No longer, I think, is this narrow swim lane, but actually, as globalization happens, more and more you're going to be interacting with different cultures, different countries. I've got a call tonight with the US, and then I think tomorrow morning I've got calls with Europe, Germany and France. That's a great thing, right? I want to know what's actually going on in those markets and what the issues are, so then I can relate to my colleagues there.
There was quite a few changes at the beginning of the year, and this comes down again to trust, because change is difficult, even when it's good, even if it's when something that people want, and trust helps you go through it. So the exercise of what's happening in the UAE and Saudi Arabia with so much change, up to this point, it's been really successful. You think of even something like a weekend change, right, in the UAE, which might sound, how important is that? But it fundamentally changed everyone's lives, like in a matter of weeks. Mm-hmm. And, everyone was surprised at the timing of it, even if perhaps the decision itself had been flagged. That to make that work, I mean, that is, to me, trust is there, trust in action, right? Mm-hmm. To make that go through. So kind of it's an illustration that if it isn't there, then whatever your idea is, no matter how good it is, it's not going to come off. Mm-hmm. You have to have that in place.
100%. You have to have credit in the bank, because then people are going to believe you and they're going to buy into the vision, and that it's actually going to work out for the best. And we're seeing that in the local report in terms of the economic optimism. The decisions and trusts that the UAE government specifically has made over the past decade or so has added to the current position it has in terms of being the second most trusted country in the world.
Well, that's all we've got time for today. Kelsey Warner, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All that remains to thank our production team, Arthur Edison, Aisha Khan, and Mahmoud Rida, and you all for listening.